Hi there, Chalmers Church family. Bruce Jones here. This is the message for Sunday, October the 20th, 2024. Happy anniversary, Chalmers Church family and friends. This is the day that we're celebrating our 164th anniversary, based on a start date of approximately 1860, which differs a little bit from what you're going to hear in just a moment. There's a difficulty in sort of dating some of these things right back to the very beginning, or knowing exactly what date to take it from. But anyway, you're going to see what I'm talking about in just a second. But hey, let me just take you to a passage of Scripture first. The Apostle Paul, talking to Timothy in his second letter to Timothy, almost at the very beginning of the letter, he says this: I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline, or a sound mind, as some other versions say. This is a great way to begin today, because in our anniversary service that we'll be having a little bit later today, hope you're able to join us. We're going to be celebrating that gift that's been passed down from generation to generation in the Chalmers Church family. In fact, we're celebrating it in a very unique way, not only in our in-person service this Sunday, but also in this recording. In our anniversary service, we have Teen Challenge Outreach team is going to be with us today, and a potluck lunch afterwards, and it'll be a really, really lovely time. We're also going to have a baby dedication today, little baby Genevieve, and also we'll be taking a picture of the congregation to be sent to the Four Cs head office, because this is something the Four Cs head office would like to do, is they're trying to get a bunch of pictures together of different congregations in the congregational churches in Canada, our particular denomination. Congregational Christian Churches of Canada, that's what the Four Cs are. And so anyway, that's coming up a little bit later today, 10 a.m., if you're able to be with us. But what I want to do for this recording, or the majority of this recording, and it's not even going to be finished by the end of this recording, so it's going to encompass another recording, is I am going to be introducing you to something that was found by Rosemary Young as she went through some personal effects of her parents, Jim and Eleanor Convey, and they had kept this particular document from quite a long time ago. It was just discovered here this month in October 2024. I'm sure maybe some of the other old-timers might remember it from a long time ago, but where one would find a copy of this particular document anymore, I'm not sure. But we have one in our midst. Now, and I'm going to be reading from this document, and this is assuming a beginning date for Chalmers of 1867, which went really nicely with the beginning of the Dominion of Canada in 1867, went really nicely with the centennial in 1967, and if you look at some of the historical things in the back foyer of the church, it's celebrating Chalmers' 100th anniversary in 1967 as well. Although, in later days, some things have come to light that can date the sort of beginning of what became Chalmers Church, at least back to as early as 1860. That's why we're counting 1860 as our time. So that, and hence the reason why this is our 164th anniversary. 164 years dated back to 1860. Now that's quite a feat. That's quite amazing. We would be in the top 10% probably, the oldest 10% of churches left in our country. So I hope you're able to be at the anniversary service, 10 a.m. this morning. I should just mention a couple other things as well before I get into this document. Ruth and I are going to be leaving for my final vacation time of the year. We leave this coming Friday, so I'm off from Friday, October 25th through to Friday, November 8th. And the 2 Sundays that I am away, October 27th, next Sunday, Pastor Ken Craig is going to be preaching in our in-person service. Then November 3rd, Pastor Bonnie Mayer is going to be preaching in our in-person service. Now, I'm around a number of days before we leave, because we don't leave until Friday. I'm working for the next number of days, but Ruth and I will be gone for the next 2 Sundays, returning back on Friday, November the 8th. So you also would like, it's important for you to note as well, the recording for next Sunday, October 27th, is going to be, and now things are coming full circle, it's going to be the Proverbs sermon from the summer that hasn't been released in these YouTube recordings yet. If this is the only way you've been following our church and you are following our Proverbs series in the summer, you're probably scratching your head going, I think we missed a few chapters in there. Aha, that's very astute of you, because I was not able to record one of those sermons before I preached it live, and so I recorded it after. So you will be able to watch the recording next Sunday, October 27th, of that Proverbs sermon that rounds out the rest of the Proverbs series. And then the recorded message on November 3rd is going to be the second half of this historical document that was written in 1967 by then 86-year-old Murdoch Matheson Sr. So, this is just a great little document. You take a wee look at this. You see that? That's how the document starts. It's obviously typewritten on a regular old manual typewriter, and it's single-spaced, 13 pages of a document on some reminiscences of Chalmers Church from his perspective. And it has not been digitized yet, this particular document, but I'm going to be making, this afternoon when I go over to the church, I'm going to be making a number of copies of it for those of you who may want to have a copy and take home with you. And for then the recording, right now, I'm just going to be reading basically the first half of Murdoch's memoirs. Now, you may be aware of the fact that there is a Murdoch Matheson alive. This would be the contemporary Murdoch's grandfather who wrote this article. So I'm going to read basically the first half of it today, maybe make a comment or two. And then November 3rd's recording, 2 weeks from today, will have the second half of these very evocative flashbacks. And so I'm really excited about this. I'm a lover of history to begin with, but especially living history, first-person accounts, such as we read all the way through the scriptures. But I'm really appreciating what I've read so far. I've read through this 3 or 4 times already, and I'm excited about reading this for you for the rest of our recording time today. And like I say, this is something that's just been unearthed a few weeks ago here in October 2024. And this article is entitled, and I'm sure that I'm not sure, I would imagine that he was asked to write this, or volunteered to write this. It says, Some Reminiscences of Chalmers Church in the Last Decade or Two of the 19th Century by Murdoch Matheson. That's Murdoch Matheson Sr. And just stop and think about that for a second, okay? These are first-person accounts from one who was a young child in the younger days of Chalmers Church, when Chalmers Church was young, when Chalmers Church was only barely 20 years old, not even 20 years old. So anyway, he starts off and he breaks it up into a number of different paragraphs, and I'll tell you the title of each paragraph as I read it. And like I say, I may have a thing or two to say occasionally from time to time. First paragraph, location of the church. And this is important stuff. He says, Chalmers Church was and is situated on the 7th concession of Kincardine Township, 2.5 miles east of what we used to call the baseline, or the gravel road, which is now called Blue Water Highway. We call it Highway 21. It is on a small plot of ground at the junction of 2 roads, the 7th concession, which runs east and west, and a side road which runs north and south. The church is in the northeast corner of the junction. This has been the location of the church since its earliest days. And then he gives us information about the location of his parents' home, or his home, the home where he grew up. Murdoch says, My parents' home was a farm on the 7th concession, slightly more than a quarter of a mile west of the church. All of our family were born and raised on this farm. I was born, get this, I was born on March 21st, 1881. Here, don't you love it? First-hand accounts of somebody writing who was born in March of 1881. And like all my brothers and sisters, I grew up, as it were, in the shadow of the church and was greatly influenced by it. Our farm was small, only 75 acres, and our family was large, 9 of us. As we moved from childhood into adolescence and later into adulthood, there was no place for us on the farm. We had to seek our livelihood in other fields of employment. My 4 oldest brothers were the first to leave, and they entered into professions of their own. My 2 sisters were the next to leave. They also entered professions of their own, but for many years they were still connected closely with the home. I was the last to leave after I graduated from high school in 1902. I was no longer bound up in the activities of the farm. My 2 youngest brothers remained on the farm. My memories of Chalmers Church are therefore mostly memories of years preceding 1902. That is to say, they are memories which come to me from the last decade or two of the 19th century. Wow, this is good stuff. When I got to this point, reading it the very first time, I thought this is an important historical document that we need to preserve and we need to be thankful for. We need to thank the Lord for the fact that this came to light. And the next paragraph is entitled The First Generation of the Chalmers Congregation. Chalmers Church was founded, I understand, in 1867. The area covered by the congregation, however, was being developed for approximately 15 years before 1867. So you can see how, people had come together and worshiped together, and kind of being able to pinpoint an exact start date is hard to do. He goes on to say, I am sorry I do not have historical documents to confirm this statement. All I can say is that my grandfather Matheson settled with his young family on a farm on the 9th concession in 1852. The farm adjoined the farm later occupied by James Convey, and was therefore within the area of the later Chalmers congregation. My father was 14 years old in 1852. It would be some years afterwards that he and his brother Donald took up their homesteads on the 7th concession, perhaps in the late 1850s. Of course, all the land, listen to this, all the land in that part of Kincardine Township was still virgin forest at the time. Every settler had to clear his land of heavy timbers. It was a long and arduous task. The settlers were few, and they were not yet organized into a community. It is no wonder that they probably could not, find a church as a place of common worship until 1867 or thereabouts. The wonder is that they could do it so soon. They must have been men and women of stalwart characters, inspired by the highest ideals of a religious life. While I cannot speak with certitude of the earliest decades of Chalmers Church following 1867, because I was of a newer generation, yet the history of those earliest decades could not have been entirely unknown to me, even when I was a child. Nearly all of the families who comprised the congregation when I was a child had been themselves among the founders of the church in 1867. Most of the adults had been original settlers in the area. They had cleared their farms of the virgin forest. They were pioneers. Many of them must have witnessed and perhaps have taken part in the very first service of worship in the new church. As a child, I was too young to be personally acquainted with them, but I could see them Sunday after Sunday in church. I knew them by sight, and I knew their names. How well I remember them to this day. There were the Campbells, the Robertsons, the MacLeods, the McCartys, the Slades, the Normans, the Husks, the Conleys, the MacArthurs, the Mackenzies, the Huttons, the Conquergoods, the Perrons, the Conveys, the McLennans, the Wrights, the Frasers, the Duncan Mathesons, and many more. Thus, whether I was conscious of it or not, as a child, there must have been a mystical link between which somehow bound me to the very beginnings of the history of Chalmers Church. Even in my old age, whenever I think of Chalmers Church, it is the oldest generation of the church who first come to my mind. It is beautiful to know that it is partly to commemorate the oldest generation that in 1967 the church is celebrating its 100th anniversary. And then he goes on to mention an interesting paragraph. The area covered by the Chalmers congregation. It shows real planning. He says, it may well be that my memory is faulty on this point. So far as I recall, the congregation was drawn exclusively from 3 concessions, the 7th, the 9th, and the 5th. On each concession, the area extended from the baseline, the Blue Water Highway today, Highway 21, to a distance of 5 miles to the east. That is to say, it extended from 2.5 miles west of the Chalmers Church side road to a distance of 2.5 miles east of the same side road. Since Chalmers Church was on the 7th concession, and since the 7th concession was midway between the 9th and the 5th concessions, the church was thus in the exact center of the entire area, built in the exact center of the sort of catchment area for that church. Isn't that great? So, makes sense why it was built where it was built. He goes on to say, the longest distance any family would have to travel from their home to the church would be 3 3/4 miles, as was the case with James Convey at the baseline on the 9th concession, and Donald Carr, Clarence Campbell's home today, also on the 9th concession, but 2.5 miles east of the Chalmers Church side road. As I recall it, families came to church from all along the whole 5 miles of the 9th concession, from the Convey home and the MacArthur home in the west to the Carr home in the east. Similarly, they came from all along the whole 5 miles of the 7th concession, from the Norman home and the Slade home and the F. McCarty home at the baseline to the R.B. Campbell home 2.5 miles east of the church. My memory is less clear about the 5th concession, but I do remember very well the 2 McLennan families in the first 1 1/4 miles east of the baseline, and the Perrin family and the Duncan Matheson family in the next 1 1/4 miles, and the Duncan Campbell family in the next 1 1/4 miles. I wish I could make a complete list of all the families up and down the 3 concessions who came regularly to Chalmers Church in those early years, but I fear I cannot. That's okay. That's okay. He said, my list would almost certainly be inaccurate as well as incomplete, for my memory has dimmed with the passage of time. I do not know whether the Centennial Committee would undertake the task or not, or whether they would care to commission someone else to do it. He goes on to say, I should note here that in the closely knit and compact area of the Chalmers congregation, which was Presbyterian in those days, there was also a Methodist church and a Methodist congregation. The Methodist church was situated about 1/4 mile or more east of Armo. It was on the south side of the road. The Armo school was on the north side of the road and directly opposite the church. In later years, both the church and the school were moved into Armo. Some of the well-known families belonging to the Methodist church were these: the Blackwell family, the Woods family, the Gerald family, the Hiles family, the Shire family, the families, the Schufelt family, the Avery family, and others. There was considerable mutual help between the Presbyterians and the Methodists, particularly in their young people's societies, and there was the friendliest spirit. For example, many Methodists attended the Presbyterian Church Endeavor Society in Chalmers Church on Sunday evenings, and many Presbyterians attended the Methodist Epworth League in the Methodist Church on Tuesday evenings. There was another highly esteemed and widely known family living on the 7th concession in those years who were neither Presbyterian nor Methodist. They were the Reekie family. They had a sawmill on the farm immediately east of Chalmers Church. The Reekies were Baptists. Woo! Baptist. I was a Baptist for 30 years too, actually for longer than that. And they go on to say 2 of their sons became Baptist ministers. One of these married one of the McDougall women of the 10th concession. In all, there was a beautiful Christian relationship among the different religious denominations of the area, covered by the congregations of the churches I mentioned. The churches themselves must have had a great influence on their people. And he goes on to talk about the ministers. My earliest memory of the ministers was of Reverend George Mackay, who occupied the pulpit of Chalmers Church for several years in the 1890s. I was then a young boy. I remember well, however, hearing it said that Reverend George Mackay was preceded by Reverend Cameron, and that Reverend Cameron was preceded by Reverend Stewart. I do not know whether Reverend Stewart was the first minister of Chalmers Church after 1867. I wish I knew. I certainly do not remember hearing it said that he was preceded by any other minister. I do remember that Mrs. Stewart, his widow, lived in Kincardine when I was in high school. She lived in a small house on Huron Terrace Street across the river. Her house was the first one on the east side of the street after one crossed the bridge going south. The house was situated some distance in from the street. I remember, too, that we had in our home a photograph of Reverend Cameron and Mrs. Cameron. It was an old-fashioned tin type. Mrs. Cameron was seated in a chair and Reverend Cameron was standing by her side. I remember how fascinated I was by the stately appearance of Mr. Cameron. I know that Reverend George Mackay and Mrs. Mackay and family lived in the manse across from the church. I presume that Reverend Cameron and Reverend Stewart and their wives and families lived there too in their day. Reverend George Mackay was succeeded by Reverend Isaac MacDonald, who occupied the pulpit for a year or two or three in the late 1890s. Reverend Isaac MacDonald was succeeded by Reverend P.M. McEachern, who occupied the pulpit for a few years before and after 1900. I think he was the minister in charge during the building of the new brick church, but I'm not perfectly sure of this. Reverend MacDonald and Reverend McEachern did not live in the manse across the road from the church. They lived in Glamis after Glamis and Chalmers had been combined into one pastoral charge. I am not in a position to recall their successors in Chalmers Church after 1902 or thereabouts, for I was no longer associated with the congregation after that date. He goes on to talk about the old Chalmers Church building. Almost all my memories of Chalmers Church are centered in the old building, which was replaced by the present brick building in, I think, 1901, or was it 1902? 1902 is what the foundation stone says. I shall speak of the old building at considerable length. It was a large frame building. I'm not sure whether it was the original Chalmers Church building, nor whether it was erected by the many first settlers. Probably there was a temporary place of worship before it. There was nothing normal in the design of the building except its size. It was noticeably large for a rural church. It would be risky for me to guess at its dimensions. Was it, say, 35 feet or more in length and, say, 25 feet or more in width? Perhaps some of the church records will give exact information on this point. The building stood on the same spot where the present brick church stands. The ends of the building faced north and south, and the east and west sides had 3 or 4, I'm not sure whether it was 3 or 4, large windows each. There was only one door, and it was in the south end. The pulpit was in the north end. There were 2 aisles leading from the door to the space in front of the pulpit. Between the aisles there were long pews, perhaps 8 or 9 of them. Between the rear pew and the door there was an open space where the large wood-burning stove stood. On the other side to each aisle there were other long pews, filled the whole back space to the south wall, leaving no room between the rear pews and the south wall. On the east and west side walls there was a small coal oil lamp set in a bracket attached to the wall between each pair of windows. There would probably be 8 such lamps in all. To reach the lamps for cleaning or lighting, one had to stand on the nearest pew. I presume there was a special lamp for the pulpit, but I cannot recall it. There was no movable furniture in the building except a small table in the open space in front of the pulpit, and doubtless a chair or 2. The table was used for communion purposes and other purposes. The floors of the aisles had no carpet until the time of Reverend Isaac MacDonald in the late 1890s. I remember how pleased Mr. MacDonald was when he came down from Glamis one evening and saw the new aisle carpet that had just been bought. Of course, all this was a common arrangement in most large churches of the time. What was uncommon in Chalmers, at least in my memory, was that in the northwest corner there were 3 other long pews. They extended north and south directly at the right of the pulpit and facing the pulpit. They were thus at right angles to the pews in the main body of the church. There was a similar arrangement in the northeast corner and to the left of the pulpit. These corner pews were naturally more visible and more conspicuous to the congregation as a whole than the pews in the main body were. I shall speak of them again in a moment. But first I wish to recall the large stable and driving shed that stood in the churchyard in the northwest corner of the lot. Some of you elder folk remember that yourselves. Most of the congregation came to church by horse and buggy or carriage or cutter or sleigh. Shelter for the horses was imperative during church services, and the driving shed was a good shelter. It was solidly built and warm and amply provided with all the necessary comforts. The worshipper in the Chalmers Church had a genuine regard for their animals. It was a part of their religion, whether they viewed it in that light or not. Now, just a word about those corner pews that I just mentioned. To me, they had a special personal significance, as I shall try to show. In those days, it was the usual practice for a family, most families were large, to have its own family pew in church. and all the members of the family sat in the family pew at every church service. A family pew was rarely occupied by anyone not belonging to the family. Our Matheson family pew was the second from the wall in the northwest corner, and as I said, it was conspicuous to the congregation. There we were during the church service, a long row of us. Father sat at the outer end of the pew, Mother sat next to him, and the children filled the rest of the pew to their left. It was a scene very familiar to the congregation, and it was often commented on at the time and for years afterwards. When I look back on it now in my old age, it seems to me that it must have been an impressive sight. The same was true of other families in the congregation. I shall refer to it again casually in the following pages. And speaking of the congregation, he goes on to talk about the church services. And this is very interesting. I was a very young boy at the time I speak of. I attended church regularly along with my younger brothers and sisters, but I was not particularly drawn to it. I tried to listen to the sermons by the Reverend George Mackay. They were doubtless excellent sermons, but they were addressed mainly to the adults of the congregation. I was too young to understand them, and besides that, they seemed to me to be too long. As a matter of fact, sermons were usually longer in those days than now. Well, maybe not so much anymore, I'm not sure. But anyway, he says, I kept wishing every Sunday, this is funny, I kept wishing every Sunday that the sermon would end. Finally, I discovered a clue that invariably told me that the end was near. The minister always had the large pulpit Bible open in front of him as he preached. From my observation, Sunday after Sunday, I noticed that after what seemed to be an interminable length of time, he would close the Bible. And in about a minute or less after that, he would stop preaching. How I longed to see him close that big book. I spent most of the hour, I think, watching for signs from him that he was about to close it. Then the welcome moment came and the sermon was over. Dear memories of childhood, he says. And then he goes on. And here is a good way that Chalmers has dealt with controversy over the years. We just can keep on keeping on and love each other through it. He goes on to say, there was no church organ in Chalmers in those years. In many Presbyterian churches of the time, a church organ was considered a profanation of church worship. It was only after long controversy and much opposition that years later an organ was purchased for Chalmers Church. It is needless today to recall the controversy and opposition, deep and sometimes bitter, as the feelings certainly were on both sides of the question. It should be recalled, however, that the men, they were mostly men, who favored or opposed the purchase of an organ were themselves men of strong character and firm connections. They were great men who stamped their personalities on the life and soul of the community in their own generation, and I fully believe in the life and soul of the generations succeeding them. Now, was there a choir in Chalmers in those years? Well, a choir was likewise considered a violation of the sacredness of church worship. Nor was there a church hymn book. Hymns were permitted in some organizations within the congregation, as for instance in the Christian Endeavor Society, but not permitted in the regular church services on Sunday morning. We sang only psalms at those services. My, how things change. How then was the congregational singing led and conducted, he asks. Well, it was led by an official who was called the presenter. Our presenter in Chalmers Church, as far back as I can remember, was Duncan Campbell, one of the elders of the church. He must have been at that time a man of at least middle age. He was father of a family of 4 sons and 4 daughters, all of whom were then or later very active workers in the church. Duncan Campbell home was on the 5th concession. It was and still is an exceptionally beautiful farm and farm home. It is owned and operated today by Wellington Campbell, grandson of Duncan Campbell, and son of D.P. Campbell, one of the 4 sons of Duncan Campbell. Wellington's widowed mother, Mrs. D.P. Campbell, lives with him on the farm. I may not have followed closely the sermons preached in Chalmers Church in those early years, for I was a very young boy, but I loved the congregational singing of the old psalms. I can still see Duncan Campbell as presenter, and I can still hear him. He wore a full beard of blondish color and of average length. He used to stand in front and a little to the right of the pulpit, and he faced the congregation. He was probably less than 10 feet from our family pew, and in full view of all of us. The congregation, all but the presenter, remained seated during the singing, as was the custom in those years. When the psalm number was announced from the pulpit, Duncan Campbell would stand and take his place. By some method of his own, he would strike the right key note, not too high, not too low. He would then begin to sing in a rich and clear baritone voice, and the congregation would join in singing with him. The singing was in a slow, measured tempo, a tempo probably suited to the stately music of the old psalm tunes. I remember how Duncan Campbell would bend slightly forward and slightly upward and then back rhythmically according to the rhythm of the singing. This movement of his body doubtless had a guiding effect on the congregational singing, similar to that of a conductor's baton on a modern chorus. Those old psalms, and perhaps particularly those old psalm tunes, left an indelible impression on the minds and the souls of the congregation. They became a part of our very beings, and I'm sure they deepened our characters. The generation of that time has passed away, a new generation now worships in its place. Did the singing by the older generation in that quiet country church, with no organ and with no choir, but with a presenter who was himself an earnest Christian gentleman, did that music leave an enduring influence also on the generation that followed? I firmly believe that it did. My own experience convinces me that it did. At my mother's funeral in January 1917, they sang the 23rd Psalm to the tune of Martyrdom. John Gray led the singing. John Gray, like Duncan Campbell, had a rich baritone voice, and he had himself been schooled in the Psalms in Chalmers Church and elsewhere. That day at the funeral, he seemed to excel himself. Mother lay in her coffin with her face visible. She had lived her life, and she was gone now to her reward. The 23rd Psalm, a soothing lullaby, never seemed so sweet before, nor the tune Martyrdom so comforting. I've heard the same psalm sung to the same tune many times since then, and I'm not ashamed to confess that tears stream down my face every time I hear it. Chalmers Church of the old days and the good people who were its congregation always come back to me with ineffable sweetness. It cannot be doubted, I think, that the pioneering generation of Chalmers Church still lives in the memory of the present generation and will continue to live in the memory of each succeeding generation. That's good stuff. We're going to leave it right there for now. And the rest of it, which covers information about church offerings, about Sunday school, about the youth group called the Christian Endeavor Society, the choir, because there was eventually a choir, Gaelic services, because there were some Gaelic services for a time, garden parties, he talks about the garden parties as well, and other social events. That remains to be read in the recording that you will hear on November 3rd. But what I've just read for you now comprises about the first half of that, of the reminiscences that we have the opportunity to listen to. I mean, just incredible stuff. Incredible stuff. Really thankful to Murdoch Matheson Sr., grandfather of the contemporary Murdoch Matheson, for writing that in 1967. I love history. I really love history. Even more when it's not just dry, dusty old dates and facts and figures and dusty data, but anecdotal history. That's what this is. These stories, first-person memoirs and impressions and memories, even if they're memories of one who was too young to be a major player in the events that he describes. This is really, really good stuff. After I finish the reading on November 3rd, I'm going to sum it up with some impressions that have been left upon me as I've read this document over 3 or 4 times. But let me just give you the first impression right now. Lasting impression for me is an impression of thanks and praise to God for His faithfulness and for His mercy all these years. No matter who's sort of in charge, quote unquote, from time to time, we're just placeholders, really, because God is the one ultimately in charge, right? Only God knows the total number of people from our church that have been touched over its years. I dare to say, in fact, I can say with an amount of certainty that that number is in the thousands, and that number is growing. And I'm so thankful and give praise to God for His faithfulness, for His mercy, for his care, for his leadership, and pray that we will continue to have an influence for generations to come until Jesus returns. Well, that's all we have time for today. Please tune in on November 3rd as I read the second half of these memoirs. Let me just close with prayer. God, we thank you. Thank you for this day. Thank you for the anniversary, 164th anniversary or thereabouts, that we're celebrating for Chalmers Church today. You are so good. Thank you for your faithfulness. We love you, and we just commit ourselves to you. A belief and a faith that believes that you're up to something. Would you continue to lead and guide our congregation from now until the day that you return, Jesus? We love you and we thank you in your name. Amen. Amen. Well, God bless you, friends. Like I say, Ruth and I are on vacation, but next Sunday, it's the Proverbs sermon that will be on this recording. November 3rd, it's the second half of this, and I'm actually going to record that before we leave, so it'll be ready for you on November 3rd as well. Like I say, we have no digital copies of this yet. We may never have, but there are paper copies, and there's also this two-part reading of the document that's available for us now. All right. God bless you, folks. Take care. Have a great rest of your weekend.